My presentation explained the result of a study started for a degree thesis in human osteo-anthropology, explaining the correlation between usage of weapons and the cut markings procured. To a complementary approach to the study of prehistoric warfare, this study makes use both of experimental archaeology, reenactment, historical reconstruction, and historical fencing, linking the usage of weapons to the interpretation of the society that has used it. The study is based on Sardinian early Iron Age iconography and archaeological facts. The Nuragic civilization starts in Sardinia, Italy, in 1800 BC in the Ancient Bronze Age, and ends around 500 BC with the Punic conquest of the island. The name of this culture came from the big stone structures called Nuragic, and a typical stone towers of the Sardinian landscape, similar to the Scottish blocks, believed to be built around 1600 and 1400 BC, and used by Nuragics until the Iron Age, around 800 or 600 BC, when they were reconverted as temple structures. Other structures typical of the Nuragic culture are the giant's tomb and the sacred wells. The first ones are much older, as they first appear in the very beginning of the Nuragic culture. These tombs are collective burials, and they can be considered similar to the Alekuvek, but with the addition of a pair of stone wings in the main entrance area, called a zedra, and with a particular vertical large flat stone with a hole in the bottom, called a centering stele. For this particular A-shaped decoration, which meaning is unknown. These burials, evolution of the Ale, are presumed to have the shape of a bull's head seen from above. They are supposed to be the tombs of the elites, but for a long time they were presumed to be just collective burials. The use of these tombs ended around the 1200 BC, when the burial ritual changes and the grave began to be simple, like the kind of Mont'é Prama. Basically, a hole in the ground covered with a flat rock or little pile of stones. The sacred wells instead, Okay, these are the tombs of Mont'é Prama. As you can see, they are very simple, just basically a hole in the ground. And the skeleton has been found like in a child position, like in the womb of the mother. And then we have the sacred wells. They have like all this architecture, particular shape of both this. It's like it's in the beginning what they presumed they were like megalons, but they now call in a general term inantis temples, like the Greek ones, but they are very different. And this is the Nuragic statues all found inside these temples, water temples and inantis temples, and they are presumed to be the whole population. We see warriors and chiefs and priestesses, etc. But we were talking about here. The sacred wells, instead, are typically used as sanctuaries. When they first appear in the Middle and Late Bronze Age, they are presumed to be later than the Nuragi, and for sure they were used for rituals, offerings, and meetings. In these temples, it was found the most part of the bronze statues of chieftains and warriors, similar to the representation of the stone statues of Mont'é Prama, height nearly 2 meters, named by the place where they have been found, a little hill near the village of Cabras in the Oristano city area. It's very interesting debate around the dating of these statues. The Sardinian scholars are divided into those who date the statues around 1100 BC and 1000 BC, and the ones dating the statues around 900 or 800 BC. These stone statues represent mainly warriors, like the little bronze statues, different figures of shielded swordsmen, archers, and hypothetical shielded boxers, but no chieftains, like this one. Of course, one of the main questions regarding these figures are what was their role, what sort of combat this warrior fought. Later on I will talk to you about the experimental studies I have done on these figures, especially about the boxers. The Nuragic culture in 100 years of studies was interpreted as a chieftain. with the main leader identified at that time with the name Capo Tribù or tribe leader, that now we know is incorrect, and his elite warriors, represented in other examples. Priests and priestesses have been recognized with particular statues, especially the ones of female dressed with in a long cloak and a sort of so-called witch hat, like this one. This figure operated in the sacred wells and in the Antis structures, water temples similar to the sacred wells, but without a vein of water from the ground. It's presumed that the water was directly brought into these places. The rest of the population has identified in the so-called praying builders, both male and female. The general interpretation made by the scholars is that the bronzes represent the whole population, warriors and chiefs, including young adults, mothers with children, and commoners. Of course, because we have the iconography of warrior, one of the main questions of the scholars is if the Nuragics were, if the Nuragic one was a warrior society or not. In my thesis, I have also approached this problem. And we see one of the so-called, this is called Madre dell'Ucciso, the mother of the killed. And for the first historian of the archaeology in Sardinia, Giovanni Leo, he presumed that the whole statues and the little bronzes were the representation like a picture of the whole population. And this is currently the actual theory. Studying the armors and the weapon, I have also tried to figure out if this theory was correct or not. Anyway, my study started with my bachelor degree thesis in osteology on 3 Nuragic skulls with evidently hailed weapon traumas. The purpose was of trying of reconstructing how the trauma was inflicted, trying to interpret the kind of weapon used and the motion of striking. All was financed to try to understand how they fight and, of course, how much violent possibly was the Nuragic culture. The whole anthropological study was based on 3 different aspects of my background: historical fencing, reenactment and reconstruction, and experimental archaeology. The archaeology support was given by Professor Anna de Palmas, and the osteological part by Professors Rosalba and Giovanni Flores of Cagliari University. The thesis is divided into different parts. In the first, I have approached the main question from an anthropological view. The documented cases of violence in the chimpanzees, and then a list of the first episode of violence in the prehistory of humanity, from Jebel Haba in 12,000 to 10,000 BC to Thalheim in Germany in 5,000 or 5,500 BC, of course. Then I have looked into the osteological finds of prehistoric Sardinia in the period before the Nuragic, the so-called pre-Nuragic period. We have different examples of bone and obsidian weapons used for injuring other members of the same species. From 10,000 BC to the Otsiri culture, the Neolithic and is 3,200 to 2,800 BC, passing through the beginning of the Copper Age in Sardinia, 2,700 to 2,500 BC, with the case of Gherreris, that is this one, in which we have a human jaw with a shard of obsidian weapon, and another one is the Mont'é Prama culture, this one, with a skull partially sculpted. The pre-Nuragic evidence of human traumas ends with the Ancient Bronze Age in Sardinia associated with the Bonanaro culture. The remains are friendly called Cisaia, that means old grandmother in Sardinia. The woman had different traumas and suffered from various illnesses. The subject has an evident healed trauma on the left shoulder and left arm, which is supposed to be a paring fracture. Those 2 traumas are presumed to be contemporary. The woman also had a transplantation of a bone wheel from his head, As one of the few cases in Europe, now is documented that the transplantation was made for healing purposes after a trauma, as proven by Ornella Baccheroni in 2013. In my thesis, I have also made a list of all the cases, and at least 10, known in bibliography in Sardinia about skull trephination. Some cases are also possibly documented for the Bronze Age, as the female one from Nuragic is the one in the center, as you can see. And this part was necessary, as we have to distinguish possible ritual surgery from curettage made for healing purposes, as can be for the one in the Nuragic skulls study. Is another one I will show you later. And this is the main part of my thesis. We had 3 skulls from different parts of Sardinia, of different times, from 800 BC to the supposed, for the supposed axe trauma from Alghero, to the 1200 BC for the one from Perdas de Fogo. These are the examples of injuries and traumas of historic time that I have studied for, because it was more easy to try a reconstruction, especially for this one that is medieval. For this one we know all the context and the possible weapons. So we had very very strong base for work on it. Anyway, yeah, this is the skull from Alghero. As you can see, the injury, the trauma is very, very narrow. It was supposed to be made with a stone axe. That was one of my first, I was adapting, that was made with a stone axe, this kind of trauma. Anyway, as you can see, this is one of the traumas experimented on a farming animal, died very soon, so it was already there. And we used a metal axe for doing this trauma. As you can see, it's very, very similar of the previous one on the human bone. Instead, the stone axe, as you can see, the edge is too much bigger, and of course the trauma would have been more like almost blunt force. Anyway, this is the skull from Perdas de Fogo that I was talking about. For this one, the injury was from the frontal to the occipital bone. As you can imagine, it's very, very long. It's a long trauma. For this reason, it's presumed to be a long blade with a great cutting power. In Sardinia, at that time, there are no other weapons that can do the same kind of damage. So we have presumed that the weapon could have been a Sardinian pistiliforme sword that can be similar to the British limehouse, at least in shape, but with more accentuated curvatures in the final part of the blade. Moreover, we have determined, as for the previous skulls, that the angle which the aggressor had swung the weapon. Both were the diagonal cuts inflicted with the right arm, frontally for the sword, possibly both frontal or from the back for the axe. The last skull we have observed instead have a particular wound on the left side of the skull that was cured operating with surgical tools. The nature of the weapon used is unknown, but we have presumed that could have been a blunt force trauma. The weapon used could not have been a thrusting weapon because it's so large that the man would have definitely died. The interesting thing observed in all the 3 skulls is that all of them were healed and the people died at very old age, presumed to be at least 40 or 50 years old. The results obtained by this thesis were several. We have observed that at least 2 wounds were inflicted with weapons, a metal axe and possibly a sword, and that 2 cases on 3 were of possible aggression, and at least 1, the sword wound, could be a war or possibly a dual wound, for the nature of the weapon itself. During the study, we have used bronze weapons on fresh corpses of fermi animals to replicate the cut marks we were analyzing. And foreseeing of this kind of weapons, were able to cut the bone. The experimental cut tests have shown that these weapons are able to cut the flesh and even the bones. but they react differently based on the shape of the blade. Some, like the pistiliforme or limehouse kind, are definitely designed for slashing motions, cutting with the heaviest part of the blade. Instead, other ones, like the carpstone, are designed for more complex usage, using the narrow part of the blade for thrusting and the middle for slashing, but probably with a push and pull action, as suggested by the particular handle, more appropriate for a delicate handling, instead of using the hammer fist grip. These are on the left you can see the originals from Sardinia, and on the right the reconstruction of sword meat Neil Gherreris. I have asked to Neil to use his swords because they are, I think, the best ones that are on the market. Because if you go to an artisan, usually they do swords that are very heavy and the edge is not even hammered. So in the results of your study, you will definitely have is not realistic. So, as I see also, Andrea used the same swords for his experimentation. That was very, for me, I was very satisfied. Based on this work, anyway, we were talking about the handling. As you can see, these swords are like an evolution of the carpstone, but you see in the part called the recastle, that is this one, in the Renaissance swords. That part was usually used to put the index finger on it for have more control on the blade, especially for the thrusting. When you want to thrust, especially in modern fencing, they have pistol grips, so your index is aligned to the blade, and it is very easy to be very precise with it. Instead, if you grab the sword like in a hammer fist, so like in this way, you have very much cutting power, but you are not very precise in trying to thrust it. The Roman gladius was used in this way because they were in very close combat. So you use the motion you wanted to do is probably this one instead of this one. Anyway, this is suggested also by some examples from Sardinia, like these ones, a variation of the carpstone with a rain protection for the index finger, like the Italian Renaissance swords that are called ringed swords or spade con anello. Anyway, the handling in this way is more precise in the thrusting motion and allow more control also in the cuts, because the index is basically supporting part of the sword. The weapon had a hammer edge, and they were cut, as I said before, by English swordmen in Woolwich. Some of them show bowing and use wear that can be seen in the originals. The cutting tests were also interesting for seeing in the weapons if the weapons could produce a similar wound to the one's object of study. The traumas were very close in the case of the axe and possible in the case of cutting with the pistiliforme or limehouse sword. Based on this work, we obtained interesting results with the experimental fightings we did for trying to understand how the wounds were procured. The reconstruction of the armor and the weapons led us to hypothesis that the main traumas on the body should be observed mainly in the hands and in the thighs of the human remains of the Nuragic period, in a similar way to what happened to the soldiers of Wisby in the 14th century AD. Most likely because the shield used and the lack of protection was probably almost the same. So when you're fighting with a small shield, usually the leg is not covered, and if you use it very close to your body, the possibility that the cuts will go to the legs are very much like a possibility that can happen. So, and of course the hand, if it is not covered with some kind of armor, you in the moment when you are trying to strike the opponent, you're going out from the covering of your shield. So this is one of the main objects to cut. Also, other evidence suggests that the motion for striking with specific swords during the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age were made in a particular way, different from the one used in the past with swords from the medieval time on. This can be applied also in the way these warriors fought, mainly using the shield for parrying and striking with the weapon, as probably was in the classic and Hellenistic times, when the metallurgy of weapons and swords will still not allow using iron or low carbon steel weapons to parry the blows. How was done from medieval times, with more performing kind of steels. Like we have some treatises that show like 133 from London Tower, or the German ones, or even Fiore di Liberi from the Italian 14th century, that they used to do the first strike, trying to control the opponent's weapon. So using the edges for gluing the two swords together, the opponent will know the pressure and where the opponent is trying to go. But with different swords, like we are talking about bronze swords, they have a completely different metallurgy. So probably the way of fighting was very different. Most likely it was for the Roman soldiers of the Celtic soldiers, or Iron Age soldiers, as you want to call it. Because the weapons were still similar, at least in the metallurgy, what metallurgy can afford to it.